American dystopia.
So our next guest is the one that's actually challenging Nancy Pelosi. Shahid Buttar, how are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks so much for having me. It's exciting to be with you.
For sure. I'll read your introduction and then I will let you have the floor, sir.
Okay.
All right. Shahid is very particular about the pronunciation of his name. I got that drilled into me before we ever started.
Right on.
All right. Since graduating from Stanford Law in 2003, you have worked in both San Francisco and Washington as a legal advocate, a nonprofit leader, a grassroots organizer, and a poet and a musician. Your wide-ranging work reflects a commitment to intersectional feminism, democratic socialism, and international human rights. In November, you aim to give Nancy Pelosi a long overdue retirement. Sir, I am cheering for you. Let's go.
All right. Well, exciting to be with you. I gather that social justice was the theme you wanted us to address, so I'll try to connect that to our campaign in this political moment. I heard some of the earlier guests reflect on pieces of this, and as I think about social justice, the piece that I would particularly emphasize is intersectionality. Marginalization comes from many different vectors and it compounds. Liberation also comes from many different vectors and it compounds. So for instance, you might face barriers to access and inclusion owing to your educational opportunities or your parents' financial status, or where you grew up, or your race, or your gender identity. Or you could face marginalization across all of those different dimensions. And that's even more challenging. Recognizing that unlocks to me a vision of government as a rectifier of imbalance, an ensurer that people have the opportunity to be judged by the content of their character. And I see that as the promise of our civilization. I see that as the goal of our government, and that's very much the opportunity before us. Now, we're living through a time of profound crisis, which I think brings the need for that intersectional awareness all the more to the fore. For instance, the pandemic. Let's focus on that before we turn to the climate crisis. The pandemic presents revelations of the ways in which we have long violated social justice norms. The death toll from the COVID-19 pandemic reflects gross disparities according to race, wealth, income, neighborhood. And these are imbalances that reflect very much long-standing marginalizations that preceded the pandemic. But the point here is that if we showed up to address those marginalizations, this pandemic would be hitting us very differently. If we showed up to address, I heard one of your earlier guests particularly reflecting on the continuing plague of police violence. And this is an issue as well for me that's been an object of longstanding concern. I've been part of the movement for Black Lives, part of the immigrant rights movement, the Occupy movement, back into the anti-globalization movement of the late 90s. And I've taken action, direct action with the movement for Black Lives in San Francisco and Oakland and St. Louis and Washington. And we need policymakers who are willing to put communities before corporations. That is the essence of what I would describe as the differentiation between politicians and candidates who serve themselves and their careers and their corporate donors versus candidates and politicians and parties which we aim to reclaim that defend the future and our constituents from the predation of the institutions, both corporate and government, that aim to restrict the future. And when I think about those institutions, I think about fossil fuel extraction companies. I think about weapons manufacturers. I think about intelligence agencies and police departments that violate people's rights with impunity with the support of both parties. And that might be an important point to press on here. I think a lot of people perceive that, and they're right, that Donald Trump is a maniac, a racist, philandering, misogynistic, would-be tyrant. And all those things are true. They forget, however, that one of the principal reasons that enables his ongoing assault on the American people and our republic is the support he receives from corporate Democrats for his policy vision, for his foreign policy, for his immigration policy, for his trade policy, for his concentration camps, for his military budgets. I could go on. And issue after issue Democrats, including House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, pave the road of a criminal president. It is unacceptable. And I see this through the lens also of a constitutional dimension. The partisan one is obvious, that you have a Democratic leader co-opted in the service substantively of Republican principles. But there's also a constitutional dimension here. The branches of our government were designed to have an adversarial relationship. The Federalist Papers talk about this very explicitly in number 10 in particular. You could think about our executive, judicial, legislative branches and the federal, state, and local levels of government as being designed like crabs in a bucket to keep any one from getting out of the bucket and becoming tyrannical. And of course, we've seen such accretion of power in the executive branch at the federal level that a criminal tyrant in the White House is threatening to destabilize the constitutional design. But in the same way that you have a Democratic leader in Speaker Pelosi serving Republican ends and paving the road for a Republican president, she, as a leader of Congress, is also constitutionally problematic by entrenching, for instance, executive secrecy, by blocking members of Congress from being able to perform their oversight functions, by limiting the subpoena power of the Select Committee on the Climate Crisis, limiting its policymaking authority. We see the congressional leadership enforcing and enhancing and entrenching executive power. And that is constitutionally problematic, even separate from the partisan concern that we can see there. So all that is to say, I'm running for office because as an advocate, I've spent 20 years fighting for social justice. I was one of the first courtroom advocates promoting marriage equality for same-sex couples in the country. I fought the FBI 15 years ago for infiltrating animal rights groups and faith institutions, including Quaker meetings. I fought the NSA through a whole bunch of vectors, done these campaigns that included everything from direct action, banner drops outside the NSA headquarters, light brigades at the White House, a hip hop history lesson and a music video. I've also been arrested in the US Senate for an act of journalism when I asked James Clapper how he justified never facing a charge for perjury for lying to the Senate under oath about mass surveillance, when just a few months before I was arrested, Eric Garner had been choked to death in the street in New York City without a charge, without a trial, on the mere suspicion of committing a trivial offense that had no victim. And I want to focus here on the dramatic tension between powerless people being persecuted, so-called justice to the point of lethal, arbitrary murder in the street, versus powerful people like James Clapper getting a pension and an entourage despite violating constitutional rights and the rights of our republic en masse on the public record. In my mind, social justice has to adhere in justice, which is to say, ensuring that no one is above the law. That includes our criminal president. Speaker Pelosi's unwillingness to pursue a real impeachment process is part of the reason why I'm running to replace her. She showed up for impeachment like a boxer throwing a fight. Happy to answer any questions, and I appreciate the chance to join you here this evening.
It's been, you touched on the fact that the Democrats are basically paving the way for this tyrannical president, and I couldn't agree with you more. And it's something that we touch on this show quite often, and it's the fact that both sides serve the same corporate masters when you boil it down. Yes. Can you talk about that for a second?
Absolutely. We would hope, and we are told in this country, that we have choices between a corporate party in the Republicans and a Labor Party in the Democratic Party. And that's not actually what the spectrum of options is. What we actually have is a choice between a fascist party in the GOP and a corporate authoritarian party in the Democrats. There is no Labor Party in the United States, and there hasn't been since the 90s. There was a historic transition, particularly under the Bill Clinton administration, when Democrats, having been consistently outraised by Republican challengers and opponents, started adopting corporate-friendly positions in order to avail themselves of corporate donations. And Bill Clinton was heralded by some for what they described as tactical genius in winning all these fights. He pushed legislation through Congress that in some ways was quite transformative. And in many of those cases, the transformation took a Republican character. And it's really easy to score tactical victories when you give up all of your strategic aims and adopt the other side's goals, right? That's what he did in some respects, putting 100,000 cops on the street, dismantling welfare, You look at the Obama administration, record numbers of deportations, prosecuting more whistleblowers as spies than every preceding administration in our republic's history combined. These are Republican goals advanced by Democratic presidents. And it's unacceptable. And it's not just the presidents doing it. I could tell that story about members of Congress, including Pelosi, but well beyond her. In Speaker Pelosi's case, for me, one of the most glaring examples of this was when she signed the funding bill to give Donald Trump $5 billion to build concentration camps on our nation's borders. She didn't have to do that. She's the person with control over the purse strings. Congress has independent influence. And yet, in that case, you could describe it more as authoritarian, but they're corporate contractors on the other side of it. In the recent HEROES Act, Speaker Pelosi proposed to include not only hazard pay for essential workers, which I support, and one-time direct cash stimulus to some working families, which is not nearly enough by a long shot. It's not universal, nor is it ongoing. One-time payments for some people is better than nothing, but it is not enough by a long shot, particularly when Nancy Pelosi in that very same bill insisted on including taxpayer-funded bailouts for corporate lobbying firms. It's bad enough that we don't have a universal healthcare program in this country. It's offensive, frankly, and particularly in a time of a global pandemic. It's just senseless in addition to vicious. But if we just look at this through the lens of the self-interest implicit in ensuring that all people can get access to a doctor in medicine, we are shooting ourselves in the feet here. And that makes perfect sense if you look at it from the standpoint of who's getting contributions from who and who is whispering in whose ear. The Democrats in Congress serve corporate masters, and they have long placed the interests, for instance, of health insurance companies and pharmaceutical companies before not just the interests of their constituents, but I want to be clear here, before the lives of their constituents. People die every day in this country because they can't get access to preventive care, just like people in other industrialized countries can, as a matter of right. And it's because we have chosen policies to put corporate interests first. And I am not okay with that. No one should be okay with that. We live in a democracy, or so we claim. And the real test before us is, will we vote for candidates who put people first? And that will make us a democracy. At the moment, I think our claims to democracy are frankly aspirational. We live in a capitalocracy. That's what capitalism means. Our politicians are selected on the basis of how they serve capital. And when they go to Congress, to your question, they serve capital. What are accumulated capital? What do we call those things? Corporations. And it is that service to corporations before constituents that in my mind is disqualifying not just of House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, but frankly, most of Congress. And we need to replace most of them. And the last thing I'd say here is that there's a generational moment. I think many people, certainly, folks I'm 45, and I think I was sort of at the cusp of a generation. A lot of folks younger than me are much more woke, particularly because they lived through the pain of the 2008 financial crisis. I went through something similar in the 90s. My family lost our home to foreclosure when I was 16 years old in the late 1980s. And when I started college in 1991, I had to leave soon after because I couldn't pay for it. And I got my undergrad degree going to night school for a decade before I had a chance to study and then teach at Stanford Law School. And for me, that exposure to struggle baked in an understanding of social justice and some of the dimensions of marginalization that other people are subjected to. And I'm running for office to relieve marginalization. That is my goal. That is the mission of intersectional feminist praxis. It is the mission of democratic socialism. It is the vision for the future that can save our civilization from the mounting twin catastrophes of a global pandemic and a climate catastrophe. And the more we double down and settle for the stale, failed paradigm of corporate rule, the more we will duck into the punch of this pandemic and the climate chaos and leave entirely too many people in their graves.
And you said something right there, and I turned 45 this year, and I think that it was our generation that really started to break away and that really started to get it. And I see the future in the ones that are coming up, and it gives me a whole lot of hope.
Yes.
Because I really believe that we it's like you said, we're at an intersection, we're at a crossroads, and I think we can change it. Thank you. I want to thank you so much for being on the show tonight.
My
I
pleasure.
would definitely want you to to give a shout out real quick to Just a Girl who helped get you on the show. So shout outs to her. And really quickly, please give out your website so that everybody can go there. And we will link that below in the description.
Thank you. Folks can find out more about our campaign at shahidforchange.us. And we're on all the social media platforms at Shahid for Change. If I might just say one thing for 10 seconds, a lot of people are struggling with hope at a dark time. You just nailed it. It is the youngins. If you are struggling for hope, find you some youth climate justice activists or some youth social justice activists in any movement, whether it's the immigrant rights movement or the movement for Black lives or the climate justice movement or the movement for global peace and justice. Youth will inspire you because they are taking action. And if you do feel disillusioned at the moment, get you around some community, some action, and some youth. They'll inspire you.
For sure, because in the end, we win. That's just all there is to it.
No doubt.
We keep phasing out all the bad stuff and phasing in the good stuff. Eventually, by golly, we'll get there. Shahid, thanks so much for being here. Man, I hope you win. I hope you win.
Thank you so much. Have a good weekend. Keep up the good work.
For sure. Thank you so much.